Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now Crysis is a game that's likely been covered more than any other on YouTube, and with the soon to be released PC remaster it's probably going to continue gaining attention. We know it's a hard game to run more because of the way it utilises processor power, and we know that it's still very good looking when the settings are turned right up. Because some modern machines still struggle to play Crysis smoothly, it's quite surprising when you look back at the original developer stated system requirements. Back in 2007, a Core 2 Duo and 8 series graphics card from Nvidia would have made a capable pairing in most situations, don't get me wrong, but they're just not all that capable here. These days it's not uncommon to experience some issues in Crysis due to Windows 10 as well. I've certainly had problems getting it running, and in fact an older PC running something like Windows Vista could potentially alleviate the need for troubleshooting right off the bat. That of course got me thinking about how well a PC built around the system requirements for Crysis actually handle the game. I'm talking a Core 2 Duo 2GB of RAM and an Nvidia 8600 GTS. This falls just short of meeting the recommended system specs thanks to the graphics card, but it represents what would have been a slightly more affordable option 13 years ago. I say that, but you would have still had to spend $200 plus for the card. According to Steam, a 256MB card like this will suffice, but how well? Firstly, let's talk about the other specs. We've aimed a little bit higher than the suggested 2.2 GHz Core 2 Duo and gone with the 2.3 GHz E6550. This is of course a 2-core CPU that isn't much good these days, just like the graphics card. Our PC here actually shipped with 4 gigs of DDR2 memory, but I've downgraded it to 2 GB to match the recommended requirements. I assume 2 gigs was suggested instead of 1 or 1.5 because of Vista. This sits atop the Asus P5K SE motherboard. This P35 chipset board cost around $120 back in the day, and it even offers support for up to 8 gigs of memory. I always give you the prices in dollars when it comes to older hardware because it's easier to find figures from how much things like this cost back in the day. Whenever I tried to find older UK prices, it can be quite difficult for whatever reason. Now 8 gigs would have been over the top back in 2007, but these days I'd suggest 8 GB as a minimum, no matter your budget. It seems that this computer was originally built by a company called Mesh, who were founded in 1987 here in the UK, and are still in operation. Maybe the person who originally put this PC together is watching. Now that would be cool. It's hard to say which components have been swapped out or replaced over the years though, so this could be considered a bit of a Frankenstein's monster. So let's just call this a mid-range gaming PC by early 2007 standards. It wasn't anything too special, but it would have made one or a few gamers quite happy. It's funny looking back at a build like this. I can imagine the Crysis minimum specs being announced, and then everyone with a 256MB card or similar would have been like, oh, thank goodness I can run it. How the reality kicked in. If I was a PC gamer back in 2007, I imagine that this is the sort of machine I would have built. I certainly would have avoided the 8800 cards as they were more expensive, and I probably would have kept a Core 2 Duo CPU in my system for years, trying to ignore the Core 2 quads that were popping up on the shelves around me, adamant that 2 cores were all you needed. That was probably true back then for a good few years. But anyway, let's see how this machine runs Crysis. Now, what I love about Crysis is how it can go from looking like the best game in the world to looking like Oblivion in a few clicks. This is Crysis with the lowest preset. Now, we had to use 720p resolution with this configuration, something you could have expected to do back in the day, but let's not forget that the resolutions back in 2007 wouldn't have been the same as the ones we use today. For example, 1920 by 1080 today is commonplace, but back then you would have been looking at running games at 1600 by 1200 if you wanted to really go for it in terms of maxing out that res on your 4:3 monitor. Crysis does not look very good here at all, but it does run with about 56 frames per second on average. yeah, it seemed to hover around 60 frames per second. The game was certainly playable, to say the least. You'll notice that the Core 2 Duo and the 8600 GTS are fairly well matched. There will be some instances whereby the CPU maxes out at close to 100%, and there will be instances whereby the 8600 GTS suffers and maxes out at near 100% usage. The VRAM usage, you can see there, is pretty much maxing out at 250 megabytes. Even with the low settings, the card has 256 megs of VRAM, and in terms of the memory usage, we're using about 1.1 gigabytes here. 2 gigabytes is of course the amount in our system currently. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the visuals. The grass doesn't really look like grass, the trees look a little bit like trees, and everything is just a little bit bright, a little bit unrealistic. And once again, it really does amaze me how these visuals differ between graphical presets. If you have a system like this though and you want to play Crysis and you don't mind 720p, well, this would have to be the way to go. Some things don't change too much, like the textures of tree bark and rocks, for example, don't differ too much between low and high settings, but for the most part, yeah, you are going to notice the changes. Anyone will notice the changes. I mean, I've got one eye that works correctly and even I can notice the changes. Nothing like making fun of yourself for a quick gag. Alright, so next up we have the medium settings, again at 720p. Now the medium settings pretty much cut our frame rate in half. Crysis does look a little bit better though. The lighting effects are better. There are a few more frame dips, as I'm sure you'll be able to pick up on screen. The sunset looks nicer, but we do retain some of those Oblivion-like visuals, especially with the trees and the blades of grass, things like that, the rock textures too. As far as I can see, the weapon textures also look a little bit better, and the game, whilst it runs at about 30 to 40 FPS with some dips into the high 20s, is still what I would consider playable. 30 FPS for me here is perfectly acceptable, though I've said it before, when it comes to FPS games like this, 60 is always ideal. If you're just looking to make your way through the single player campaign, you've got old specs like this, then you could probably turn things up to medium, but when it comes to things like the Ascension level, forget about it. 100% usage on the CPU once again at certain intervals here, and the same can be said for the GPU. It's a very similar story to the one we saw just now. Again, the VRAM is maxing out because it was maxing out at low. I'm sorry if you can hear someone's dog barking. It's not my dog barking. I haven't got any food on me, so he's certainly not barking, but someone's dog out there is angry about something. Anyway, Crysis on the medium settings, it looks okay and it plays okay, but let's move on to high, because this is where things go a little bit wrong. Crysis with the high preset at 720p runs with about 15 frames per second, and so I had to adjust the resolution, as you can see here, to 800 by 600. Now, to be honest, it doesn't look too bad. If you were playing on a 4:3 monitor, a smaller 4:3 monitor, you could probably get away with it with at least 30 FPS. It runs very similar here as it does at medium settings at 720p, so you can either play at high settings with 30 FPS at 800 by 600 or medium settings at 720p with the same frame rate. Once again, the CPU and GPU usage differed between 100% on both components, but yeah, it was a reasonable experience. Back in 2007, I could probably play it at 800 by 600 if I really wanted to experience this game. It doesn't bother me too much, and it doesn't look as blurry as some games at this resolution, which is nice, but yeah, on a 4K display you're certainly going to notice a few visual problems. As you can see, as we're getting into a combat heavy situation, I can start to take back a few of those things I said about similar performance to medium settings, because sometimes the frame rate will drop into the single figures, which obviously isn't ideal. I think it just goes to show you though that Crysis, with a mixture of the minimum recommended system requirements, fares okay, certainly better than some other games. For example, if you try and run GTA 4 on the minimum system requirements, well, you're going to see a lot more problems there than you are here. So I like the way that Crysis was fairly inclusive, even if you did have to turn the visual effects down in order to retain some sort of playable frame rate. It was, after all, a showcase of what PC hardware can do, and it's just inspired a meme that I'm sure will go on for ages, and hopefully one that will continue when we see the remastered version of the game. This has been the Crysis System Requirements PC. I probably won't call it recommended System Requirements PC or minimum because, as I say, it's somewhere in between, but the Core 2 Duo E6550 and the 8600 GTS give you a reasonable experience, but it is best played at low. Hopefully soon we can test out the 8600 GTS in a few more games, but as for now, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, leave a like on it down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Let me know your fondest memory of Crysis and, of course, any of the hardware I've tested today in the comments down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.